Margaret Sullivan spent 6 agonizing months trapped in unbearable nerve pain that no doctor could cure, watching helplessly as her daughter Claire sacrificed her own marriage to become a full-time caregiver. When Margaret finally found relief through an unconventional remedy she discovered online, her own daughter became the antagonist, dismissing her mother's experience, calling her choices insane, and walking out in anger rather than accepting that something outside medical textbooks could actually work. But Claire's 2 weeks of research led to a shocking discovery that changed everything, revealing legitimate scientific studies proving Margaret had been right all along. Just listen to how this emotional battle between a suffering mother and her skeptical daughter transformed into a powerful story about trusting yourself, and why sometimes the greatest healing comes not from being proven right, but from finding understanding when you need it most. Margaret Sullivan had always been a woman of reason. At 73, she had witnessed countless health fads come and go, trusting only doctors and science. She had raised her daughter Claire the same way, to question everything and demand evidence. Yet here she stood in her kitchen at midnight, holding a clove of garlic and staring at her swollen feet with desperation and shame. The pain had begun 6 months earlier as mild tingling in her toes. Within weeks, it transformed into relentless agony. Each step felt like walking on broken glass. Simple tasks became impossible challenges. Walking to the mailbox required genuine courage. Standing to cook left her in tears. Claire had taken her to 3 different doctors. The first prescribed basic anti-inflammatory medication that did nothing. The second diagnosed peripheral neuropathy and gave her stronger pills that made her violently sick. The third specialist was brutally honest. Surgery was the only real option, but at her age, with her heart condition, the risks were severe. He couldn't promise she would survive, and he couldn't guarantee it would work. Sleep became impossible. Margaret lay awake through endless nights, trying desperately to find relief. She elevated her feet, removed pillows, tried every position imaginable. Nothing helped. The burning intensified after dark, as though invisible flames consumed her feet. She cried silently, not wanting to wake Claire, counting hours until exhausted dawn. Claire had moved back home within weeks, insisting her mother needed support. Margaret protested weakly, knowing her daughter's marriage to David was already strained. But Claire had been determined, settling into her childhood bedroom with fierce dedication. At first, Margaret felt grateful for help with daily tasks that had become nearly impossible. But as months passed, Margaret watched her condition destroy her daughter's life. Claire's eyes carried permanent exhaustion. Phone conversations with David grew tense and brief. Margaret overheard Claire crying one night, whispering that she didn't know how much longer she could manage, that she felt torn between 2 people she loved. The guilt rivaled her physical pain. She was pulling Claire away from her own life, watching her marriage crumble. Tonight began like every recent evening. After dinner, Claire settled on the couch with her laptop, attempting to catch up on neglected work. Margaret retreated to her bedroom, struggling through changing into pajamas without her daughter witnessing her difficulty. Sleep proved as elusive as ever. Around 11, Margaret gave up trying. She reached for her phone, something she rarely used beyond basic calls. Social media felt foreign, but tonight, drowning in pain and solitude, she opened one of the apps Claire had installed. The video appeared immediately, its bold headline impossible to ignore. Margaret's finger hovered over the scroll button, ready to dismiss obvious clickbait. But something made her pause. Perhaps the late hour, the fresh wave of burning, or simply crushing hopelessness. She found herself reading the comments. What she discovered shook her skepticism. The comments weren't from scammers, but from people with elderly faces and profile pictures, genuine accounts. Person after person shared detailed experiences. A 70-year-old man described avoiding amputation. A grandmother wrote about finally playing with grandchildren. A retired nurse admitted initially dismissing the idea before finding real relief. Margaret read comment after comment, her heart racing. These were people like her, facing similar struggles and failures of conventional medicine. They weren't selling anything, just sharing experiences with raw honesty. Her rational mind screamed warnings. This was anecdotal evidence, not science. Everything she believed argued against trusting internet strangers over trained doctors. But another part of her, watching her daughter's life collapse, whispered differently. What did she have to lose? Margaret quietly made her way to the kitchen, moving slowly through darkness to avoid waking Claire, who had dozed off on the couch. She opened the refrigerator and found what she needed. The garlic clove sat heavy in her palm. Margaret peeled it slowly, her arthritic fingers struggling with the papery skin. The sharp, pungent smell hit immediately. She had cooked with garlic countless times but never considered it beyond flavoring. Standing in her midnight kitchen, garlic prepared and feet throbbing, Margaret faced profound conflict. Everything she had believed argued against this moment. This wasn't medicine or science. This was desperation dressed as hope. But looking at her swollen feet, Margaret realized her choices had narrowed impossibly. Continue in agony while watching Claire sacrifice everything. Risk her life on surgery that might fail. Or try this strange remedy hundreds swore had helped. With trembling hands, Margaret lowered herself into a kitchen chair. She took a deep breath and made her choice. She began rubbing the garlic clove against her right foot, the smooth surface gliding across swollen skin, releasing more scent. She worked methodically, covering every inch, between toes, around her heel, then repeated on her left foot. The smell grew stronger, filling her kitchen and probably reaching where Claire slept. Margaret wondered if her daughter would wake and discover this bizarre ritual. Part of her hoped Claire would sleep through it. Another part wished for company in this vulnerable moment. As she finished, feet glistening in dim light, Margaret felt something unexpected. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the tiny seed of it. She had taken action, however foolish. She had refused to accept suffering as inevitable. Whether this helped or not, she had claimed some control over her own body. Margaret sat as the clock moved past midnight, sharp garlic smell her only companion, wondering if this represented her lowest point or the beginning of something different. She wondered if she had lost her grip on reason, surrendered to desperation so completely she would believe anything. But beneath all those questions, beneath shame and doubt and fear, Margaret felt the faintest whisper of something she hadn't experienced in months. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. And in her circumstances, even that fragile possibility felt like a lifeline worth grasping, regardless of what her rational mind insisted was true. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity. Margaret opened her eyes to sunlight filtering through her curtains, and confusion washed over her immediately. Something felt profoundly different. She had slept. Not the fitful dozing that had become her norm, but real, deep, restorative sleep for the first time in months. She lay still, trying to understand what felt so strange. Then it struck her. The burning pain that usually jolted her awake repeatedly throughout the night had let her rest. She had fallen asleep after her midnight ritual and stayed asleep until morning light woke her naturally. Margaret sat up slowly, bracing herself for the familiar explosion of agony that greeted every morning. She waited for the shooting pains through her feet and legs that had become as predictable as sunrise. It didn't come. The burning was still there. She could feel that uncomfortable heat, but the volume had been turned down dramatically. Where before the pain had been screaming and all-consuming, now it felt more like distant warmth, still present, still noticeable, but no longer dominating her entire existence. Carefully, Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cool floor. She waited for the usual spike of pain, that feeling of standing on knives. Nothing. The sensation was uncomfortable but bearable, remarkably bearable. She stood up, shifting her weight slowly. She took a step forward, then another. She was walking without the permanent grimace, without tears springing to her eyes, without gripping furniture for support. The improvement wasn't complete. Her feet still hurt, but the difference felt like the contrast between a candle and a forest fire. The relief flooding through Margaret was so overwhelming that her legs felt weak. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, tears springing to her eyes. But these were different tears. These were tears of shocked gratitude, of disbelief, of something dangerously close to hope. Margaret made her way to the bathroom, each step a small miracle. The hallway that had become a gauntlet of suffering was suddenly just a hallway again. She could walk without planning each movement, without steeling herself for the next wave of agony. Looking in the mirror, Margaret saw the permanent tightness around her eyes had loosened. The lines of constant pain seemed less deep. She looked more like herself, like the person she had been before this nightmare began. But doubt crept in. This couldn't be real. The garlic couldn't actually have worked. That was impossible, unscientific, irrational. It must be coincidence, natural pain cycling. Yet the timing was undeniable. 6 months of unrelenting agony, and the first night she tried this remedy, she experienced relief. She made her way to the kitchen, moving with forgotten freedom. The smell of garlic still lingered faintly. Margaret stood in the center of the room where hours ago she had sat in shame, and tears streamed down her face again. That's how Claire found her an hour later. Her daughter emerged from the living room, looking rumpled and tired, having spent an uncomfortable night on the couch. When Claire saw her mother crying, worry transformed into alarm. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" Claire rushed over, panic in her voice, grabbing Margaret's arms and scanning her face. Margaret tried to speak, but words wouldn't come at first. "I slept," she finally managed, voice rough. "I actually slept, Claire. And the pain. It's better. Not gone, but better. I can walk without wanting to scream." Claire's expression shifted to confusion. "What do you mean better? Did you take something?" Margaret hesitated. This was the moment she'd been dreading. "Last night, after you fell asleep, I tried something I saw online." She watched skepticism bloom on Claire's face. "I rubbed garlic on my feet, and this morning everything is different." Silence fell heavy. Claire's face went through rapid emotions before something like anger settled in. She released Margaret's arms and stepped back. "Mom, that's ridiculous." Claire's voice went flat. "You probably just had a good night. The pain cycles sometimes. Don't get your hopes up based on internet nonsense." The dismissal hit like a physical blow. Margaret had expected skepticism, but hearing it from her daughter stung deeply. "Claire, I'm just telling you what happened. I know it sounds crazy, but..." "It doesn't just sound crazy, Mom. It is crazy," Claire interrupted, voice rising with frustration. "Garlic doesn't cure nerve damage. That's not how the body works. You're experiencing placebo effect at best. Please don't tell me you're going to start believing in this." Margaret heard the unspoken accusation. Don't become one of those people. Don't abandon reason. These were values Margaret had instilled in Claire, principles she'd lived by. Now they were being used against her own experience. "I raised you to be logical," Claire continued, tone softening. "To trust real medicine, not folk remedies. I don't want you disappointed when the pain comes back, because it will. This is just coincidence." Margaret nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. "You're probably right," she finally said carefully, seeing relief on Claire's face. "I'm sure it's just coincidence." But she didn't believe those words. She knew what she'd experienced. She knew the difference between her usual pain and this morning's relief, and she knew what she would do tonight. After Claire left for work, making Margaret promise not to do anything foolish, Margaret went about her day with unexpected lightness. She cooked breakfast standing, something recently impossible. She did housework, folded laundry, even walked to the mailbox without crying. The improvement wasn't imagination, it was real. But as day wore on, Margaret found herself hiding her improved mobility when Claire was around. She exaggerated her limp, made faces of pain she didn't entirely feel. Claire was watching with suspicious eyes, looking for proof the garlic had done nothing. Margaret found herself performing pain to match her daughter's expectations. That night, after Claire went to bed, Margaret returned to the kitchen. She stood in darkness holding another garlic clove, feeling like a criminal. The secrecy made her feel childish, like a teenager sneaking out. She was 73, hiding from her own daughter, but as Margaret rubbed garlic on her feet again, breathing that sharp smell, something shifted inside her. This wasn't about proving anything to Claire. This was about her own body, her own pain, her own experience. If this remedy was giving relief, she would use it regardless of what anyone thought. 3 days passed. Each morning Margaret woke, having slept through the night. Each day she moved with increasing ease. The burning didn't disappear, but continued diminishing. becoming background noise rather than the main event. And each night, after Claire slept, Margaret returned to the kitchen for her secret ritual. She walked around the house now with almost miraculous freedom. She could stand preparing food without tears, walk room to room without planning each movement, even venture outside for short walks. The improvement was undeniable and completely at odds with everything she'd been told to expect. But Margaret hid this progress from Claire. When her daughter was home, Margaret moved more carefully, acted more limited than she felt. The deception felt terrible, but she couldn't bear Claire's skeptical dismissal. The relief felt too precious, too fragile to risk exposing to rational criticism. Margaret felt like a child hiding candy. The role reversal was uncomfortable and humiliating. She had spent decades being the authority in Claire's life. Now here she was, sneaking around her own house, performing pain, protecting her secret relief like something shameful. But despite the guilt and foolishness, Margaret couldn't stop. The garlic ritual had given back something she thought lost forever. Whether placebo, coincidence, or something her rational mind couldn't explain, the results were real. She was sleeping, walking, living instead of merely surviving, and that was worth any amount of shame or secrecy. By the end of the second week, Margaret's transformation had become impossible to hide. She was cooking again, standing at the stove for extended periods without needing to sit. 10 minutes had been her absolute limit before the burning became unbearable. Now she prepared full meals, moving between refrigerator and counter with her old efficiency. She had walked to the mailbox that morning, down her entire driveway and back, without tears. The journey that had become a dreaded ordeal was suddenly manageable. She felt cool morning air on her face and experienced something close to joy. Claire noticed, of course. Her daughter had spent months cataloging every wince, every sign of suffering. That watchful attention now turned suspicious. Margaret could feel Claire's gaze following her movements, calculating, analyzing. The confrontation came one evening as Margaret stood preparing dinner, chopping vegetables after 20 minutes on her feet. "Did you start taking those pills again? The ones that made you sick?" Claire's voice was carefully neutral. Margaret set down her knife. "No pills. Then what changed? 2 weeks ago you could barely walk to the bathroom. Something must have changed." Margaret sat at the kitchen table, gesturing for Claire to join her. Her daughter reluctantly took the chair across from her. "I've been using garlic," Margaret said steadily, "rubbing it on my feet before bed, every night for 2 weeks. The silence felt deafening. Claire's face cycled through disbelief, concern, then anger. "Mom, that's insane. Garlic doesn't cure nerve pain. You're experiencing temporary remission or natural cycling. This is dangerous thinking." "Dangerous?" Margaret felt her own anger rising. "What's dangerous is living in constant pain while doctors prescribe pills that make you sick. What's dangerous is being told surgery might end your life. What's dangerous is you sacrificing your marriage to care for me because medicine couldn't help." Claire stood abruptly. "So you'd rather believe in magic than medicine? Trust internet videos over trained professionals?" "I'd rather believe in something that actually works." Margaret stood too. "I don't care if it's magic or science or placebo. For 6 months I couldn't sleep, couldn't walk, couldn't live. Now I can. That's my reality. It's coincidence, your body adjusting, or 100 other explanations that don't involve believing vegetables cure neurological conditions." Claire's composure cracked. "Do you understand how this sounds? I don't care how it sounds. I care about not suffering. I care about you being able to go home to your husband instead of sleeping on my couch. You're not a burden. I chose to be here. And I'm telling you, I don't need that help anymore. Something changed, whether you accept it or not." The argument escalated, voices rising, old hurts surfacing. Claire accused Margaret of abandoning critical thinking. Margaret countered that Claire was so committed to being right, she couldn't accept contradictory evidence. Finally, Claire grabbed her jacket. "I can't do this right now. I can't watch you go down this path." "Claire, please. I need space to think. I'll call you in a few days." Then she was gone. Margaret stood alone in her kitchen, half-prepared dinner forgotten, something inside her cracking. She watched Claire's car disappear down the street. The house felt impossibly empty. That night, despite everything, Margaret stood in her kitchen holding another garlic clove. Her hand trembled as she peeled it, tears running down her face as she began the familiar ritual. Because whatever the reason, whatever the science, whatever her daughter believed, Margaret was living without constant agony for the first time in 6 months. She couldn't give that up, not even for Claire's approval. As garlic smell filled her kitchen, Margaret realized the terrible price. Her feet might be healing, but her heart felt broken differently. She had traded physical pain for emotional devastation. The next morning, a note on the counter confirmed her worst fears. Claire needed space to process everything, time to think about their relationship. She would call in a few days but needed distance now. Margaret read it 3 times, then sat at the kitchen table and let herself cry. Deep, wrenching sobs shook her body. She sat alone, feet pain-free but heartbreaking, wondering if relief had cost her the most important relationship in her life. What good was walking without pain if she had nowhere to walk? What good was sleeping if she woke to emptiness? Margaret thought about calling Claire, apologizing, promising to stop. But she knew she couldn't. Not just because she didn't want to return to suffering, but because something deeper was at stake. If she denied her own experience to please Claire, what did that say about her right to make choices about her own health? The day stretched ahead, long and empty. Margaret moved through her house, able to walk without pain, but unable to find joy. She wondered whether this was the price of believing in herself, whether choosing her own truth had cost her daughter's love. 2 weeks passed in painful silence. Margaret continued her nightly ritual, the garlic now a symbol of both her recovery and her isolation. She could walk to the store, tend her small garden, do all the things she'd thought were lost forever. But without Claire, the victories felt hollow. The house that once felt too small now felt cavernous. Each evening, as Margaret performed her routine, she thought about Claire. She wondered where her daughter was staying, whether she was angry or simply disappointed. The silence gnawed at her. Margaret's physical transformation continued. She walked to the grocery store 3 blocks away, tended her garden, prepared elaborate meals she ate alone. All the things she had thought lost had been restored, but without Claire's presence, these achievements felt meaningless. What was the point of walking if she had nowhere meaningful to go? When Claire finally appeared at the door, Margaret braced herself for another fight, but her daughter looked different, tired with shadows under her eyes, but softer somehow. The hard edges of anger had worn away. "Can I come in?" Claire asked quietly. They moved to the kitchen, that familiar space where so much conflict had played out. Claire sat at the table, gesturing for Margaret to join her. "I did research," Claire said without preamble. "Real research. Medical journals, clinical studies. Mom, there's actual science behind this." Margaret felt the world tilt. "What?" Claire pulled out her phone, showing bookmarked articles. "Garlic contains allicin, a compound with anti-inflammatory and circulation-improving properties. When applied topically to the feet, it can be absorbed through the skin. There are studies about it helping with peripheral neuropathy, arthritis pain, even circulation issues. It's not magic, Mom. It's biochemistry." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "You researched it." "I was so angry at you for what I thought was abandoning logic, but then I realized I was the one being illogical. I was dismissing your experience because it didn't fit my expectations. I'm sorry." They sat together in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Margaret had started this journey in desperate solitude, now filled with understanding. Claire reached across the table and took her mother's hands. "Teach me," Claire said. "Show me exactly what you do, because if this is helping you, I want to understand it." That night, they prepared the garlic together. Margaret showed Claire how she peeled the cloves, crushed them slightly, applied them thoroughly. She explained her experiments with timing and application. Claire listened intently, asking questions, genuinely trying to understand. As the sharp smell filled the kitchen, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not just physical relief, but emotional healing. "You know what the real miracle was?" Margaret said softly. "Not the garlic. It was finding the courage to trust myself when everyone else doubted. It was learning that sometimes the answer isn't in what experts tell you, but in listening to your own body, your own willingness to try. Claire nodded, tears in her own eyes now. And I learned that sometimes being smart means being open-minded, that dismissing something because it seems unconventional is its own kind of ignorance. They talked for hours that night about trust and autonomy, about the limits of conventional medicine and the value of lived experience. They talked about how love sometimes means letting people make their own choices, even when you disagree. As Margaret settled into bed that night, feet covered in garlic paste and heart full of peace, she understood that the real transformation hadn't been physical at all. It had been the journey from desperation to empowerment, from isolation to connection, from doubt to faith in herself. The garlic had been the catalyst, but the miracle was in the courage to believe her own experience mattered.